guys seem to always really enjoy when I make videos like this, just kind of want to like sit down, talk about some games that I love, gush about some games that I love. In recent times, any times that we've, made videos like this, it's been about indie games, but today we're actually going to be talking about horror games because not only is it spooky month, but if you guys are watching this on the day that it goes up, it is also Friday the 13th, so happy Friday the 13th if that's something we should really be celebrating. In most places, I'd say it's okay to celebrate that holiday, but I live in Florida, so I gotta be careful. We got a couple indie games on here, a couple lesser known games, and also some big AAA games, so strap in. The first game that I got for you guys today, well, this is gonna be a common theme, right? This isn't necessarily just a top 5 games list, it's kind of like a 5 games, but I cheated, because by the end of it, we're gonna be covering like 20 games. Anyway, the first game is Dead Space, and this kind of applies to the whole trilogy, but I guess more specifically, we'll focus on the Dead Space remake, since that's like the most recent game at the time of me recording this. The Dead Space remake. Where do I even begin with this game? It is a remake of the all-time classic Dead Space. Unfortunately, we do not have confirmation as to if a Dead Space 2 or 3 remake are coming. And obviously, if they do end up making a Dead Space 3 remake, that would be rather interesting. I love Dead Space 3. I'm one of the few people that can, honestly, truthfully say that. But if they were to remake that game, it is, I wonder how they'd go about it. If I'm gonna be honest, I think that if they were to remake Dead Space 3, they'd probably take, like, the Resident Evil remake approach, like something like Resident Evil 4, where they take the original game, but then they'd, like, spin it to kind of, like, fall more in line with the more horror-centered tone that they went for in this remake. And, obviously Dead Space 2, even the original one, like, that one also started to lean into the action a bit more, but it was still pretty spooky, so I wonder what they're going to do if they end up remaking those games. Anyway, look at me. We're literally like not even 2 minutes into the video and I'm already blabbering. But yeah, Dead Space Remake, if you haven't played it before, I highly recommend playing that, or just the original games, period. Like, all of the Dead Space games are absolutely amazing. Next up, this one is going to be a little interesting because, on most of these like Halloween games lists, you'd expect it to all be like horror games, something super scary. But no, I actually want to talk about Costume Quest 1 and 2. If you have not played Costume Quest before, essentially you're playing as these kids that are, going trick-or-treating, except while you're trick-or-treating, let's just say you stumble upon the wrong house and your sister gets stolen, and this is referring to the first game specifically, but your quest is to get your sister back, and you have to fight these goblins, and the costumes that you wear, you get to switch between like Halloween costumes, right? And depending on what costume you're wearing, you get like different abilities in battle, different actions, different moves you can pull off, and it's really cool. I don't want to spoil a whole lot because the game itself, the first game specifically, isn't very long. You can beat it in like 4 or 5 hours, so the more I say about it, the more I'd be spoiling. It's one of those games that I highly recommend. Same thing with the second one. The second one's a little bit longer and it expands on the story. I'm not going to talk about the story for the second one just because obviously it's the sequel, so if I talk about that one, it might spoil some things from the first one, but I can highly recommend both of these games, and the gameplay is rather similar between both of them, but they're both absolutely amazing. Next up, I'm cheating. Once again, I've been cheating for all of the games so far, and now that I'm looking at my list, yeah, I cheated on all of these, but it's like, it's a loose 5 games, you know what I mean? It's like, here's 5 games, but, while I talk about one game, there's probably other games that can probably, like, tie into it or also apply here, and the same is, goes for all of these games, really, but the next one is Bloodborne. And while I'm talking about Bloodborne, I'll just go ahead and say it now, I would also recommend Demon's Souls and Dark Souls 1. Dark Souls 2 isn't as spooky, and Dark Souls 3... I don't know, man, like, I guess it could work for Halloween, but that one's just more depressing than anything. Not because the game is bad or anything, but it's just like, when I think about that game, I guess Dark Souls 3 could work for Halloween. Just make sure you have, like, a box of tissues nearby, because, man, Dark Souls 3 can really put you in a mood. Anyway, the main one that I wanted to highlight is Bloodborne, so let's go ahead and talk about that. Bloodborne. Oh, wow, Bloodborne, like, I go to talk about the game, and I literally don't even know what to say about it. We'll just sum it up in a couple of words. Yharnam, saw cleavers, hunters, werewolves, like, do you really need to hear any more? Like, most of the bosses in the game are these, like, giant werewolves and furry beasts and, like, electrical beasts, and there's just, the bosses in this game. The one criticism that I've had for this game in the past is that the bosses can feel a little samey sometimes, but for the bosses that stand out, man, do they stand out. Now, this isn't a spoiler, but like the first boss of the game, for example, or one of the first bosses you can encounter in the game, like Father Gascoigne, oh my gosh, what a spectacular fight. The combat in this game is just, it's one of those things that I could praise for days on end. I absolutely love the combat in this game. It's lightning fast, and there's so many different ways that you can engage with the combat. So, some people tend to criticize this game because there's not as many weapons in it, but then you have to remember the trick weapons in this game and how, like, every weapon in this game is essentially 2 or maybe even 3 different weapons, not to mention the transform attacks, and there's just, there's so many things at play with this game's combat system. It's so good. You know a game is good when I'm sitting here literally like pulling on my hair, getting overwhelmed, trying to think about what to talk about this game and what not to talk about, because like it's one of those games where like talking about certain things could be considered a spoiler, but on the other hand, it's like there's so many things to talk about that it's just like my brain goes all over the place when I try to. It's an absolutely amazing game, and if you haven't played it before, I highly recommend that you play it this Halloween. And if you have a PlayStation 4 or 5, it is also available through the PlayStation Plus Extra catalog. That's essentially like PlayStation's version of Game Pass or whatever. So yeah, if you have that, I can highly recommend playing it there. And if not, you can pick it up on eBay for like, I don't know, maybe like 10-15 bucks. I got a sealed copy just like a year ago for like 10 bucks. Another game that I wanted to highlight here that kind of falls into the whole Bloodborne thing would be Lies of P. This one's obviously a bit more of a recent release, but it's also available on Game Pass, and man, it is such an amazing game. Just to explain how much I loved this game, the game came out, I sat down and played it, and I beat it in the span of 24 hours. If that doesn't say that I love this game, I don't know what will. I highly recommend Lies of P. Next up, we have The Evil Within 1 and 2. Yes, once again, I'm cheating. Like I said, that goes for all the games, unless I cheated on all of them. But specifically, we'll focus on The Evil Within 1, because while The Evil Within 2 is still spooky, scary, creepy, whatever, it's, I don't know, it relies less on the horror, I guess. Like, that game feels more of, like, a survival action, you know, like, it relies more on, like, the survival aspects more than the horror aspect. Like, there's still plenty of horror aspect. Like, there's still plenty of moments in the game where, like, I was, like, jumping out of my skin, like, oh my god, that was terrifying. But especially with the first game. Like, the first game really leans into the like, survival horror roots. So, if I could describe The Evil Within, if you haven't played it before, which if you haven't played it before, oh my gosh, you were severely missing out. It is such a good game. Don't listen to the critics. There's so many critics and, like, critical gamers out there like, oh, Evil Within wasn't that good. No, The Evil Within was an absolute masterpiece. The best way that I can describe it is Resident Evil 4, if it relied more on, like, the gore and the horror elements. Like, there were so many, like, horror elements here, but also like psychological horror, and it's just, it is such an amazing game. It'll mess with your mind. Even to this day, when I go back and replay this game, because, you know, I've been playing this game ever since the first game. I remember, like, leading up to that game's release, I was so excited for it, and then I got it on launch day, and it's one of those games where I don't play it every year, but, like, I return to it every, like, 2 or 3 years, and it's just, it is such a good game. I will say, even for the horror veterans out there, even if you played some spooky games before, I don't know, man. I think even this one will put you on the edge of your seat. I know it did for me. And, you know, I've been playing, you know, games since, like, the PS1 era, right? Like, I grew up with, like, the OG Resident Evils, for example. But, man, yeah, this one, even for me, it put me on the edge of my seat and made me jump out of my seat several times. And, again, I can highly recommend the second game as well. Relies less on the horror elements, but it's still pretty spooky game. Next up, I just got a couple of honorable mentions I wanted to run through. We're not going to linger on these for too long, but the first one is Little Nightmares 1 and 2, Fatal Frame, Silent Hill, Dino Crisis. Y'all gotta play Dino Crisis. Amnesia, literally any of the Amnesia games. There was one that just came out a couple of months ago, right? A couple months ago? Yeah, The Bunker. That game was absolutely phenomenal, and yeah, that one also made me jump out of my seat a couple of times, but the whole Amnesia series is absolutely amazing. Oh, another one that I could also recommend by proxy while I'm thinking of it is Soma. Somebody could probably, Soma also makes me think of like BioShock, and I was gonna recommend BioShock on this list. I don't know if that's necessarily a Halloween game. It's kind of spooky. It's more about the atmosphere, really, more than, like, actual horror. But, you know, that's another one I can recommend, I guess. Outlast, Alan Wake, and also, like, the spin-off game that they had for that. Batman Arkham Asylum. That one, that's, like, out of all the Batman games, right? Like, I guess really any Batman game would be good for Halloween. But there's something about Arkham Asylum where I always go to it during Halloween. It's just, it's perfect for that time of year. You know what I mean? Just the vibes in that game and that atmosphere is just, it's on point. And then, The Walking Dead, the Telltale games, I really wanted to recommend those just because, like, I feel like it's getting to that point where those games are old enough now, especially with, like, Season 1 and all that, where the newer generation of gamers, they just simply were either just being born or just happened to miss those games. So that's one that I want to highlight because, you know, those are games that I feel like everybody should play at least once, especially Season 1, at least Season 1. You can knock it out in maybe, like, I don't know, 9 or 10 hours tops. And it's divided up into 6 episodes if you count the DLC, but the base game, it's 5 episodes, roughly about an hour and a half, 2 hours each, and then you have the DLC afterwards, but man, it is such an amazing game. It's definitely a tearjerker by the end. And then the last game I wanted to recommend as like an honorable mention is Luigi's Mansion. Literally any of the Luigi's Mansion games, even if you just pick up like Luigi's Mansion 3 for the Nintendo Switch, All of them are amazing, and it's just, oh man, I'm so excited for that Luigi's Mansion 2 remake that they're doing. But I also wonder if they're gonna do like a remake for Luigi's Mansion 1. Because Luigi's Mansion 2, the remake they're doing, it's more or less just like a remaster to the Switch. But I wonder if they're gonna do like a full maybe not even a 1-to-1, but just like a full from the ground up remake for Luigi's Mansion 1, and that's why they haven't done it yet. Maybe they're waiting to do that with the Nintendo Switch 2, so they can kind of have like that one game that like shows off the power of the next Switch or whatever their next console is gonna be. But regardless, those are my honorable mentions. Those are just some games that I wanted to highlight. And finally, the last game on my list is gonna be, once again, kind of like 2 games, and by proxy, like 20 games. But anyway, Resident Evil 1. So, the trailer that I'm gonna put on screen is the Resident Evil 1 remake, because as much as I would love to recommend and say, hey, go out and play the original, there's a couple of issues. So first off, not only is the original one not necessarily as easily accessible, the only real ways that I can think of to play it outside of, emulation and those means, would be through like PlayStation Plus Premium, for example, or if you have a PS3 still and you like buy it through the PSN store. So due to accessibility reasons, and on the other hand, I understand, there's a couple elements about the first game, depending on what version you pick up, it can be a little dicey. Like if you get the original version, obviously, there's no auto-aim, which can make the game a bit harder than it needs to be, and then if you get the one Director's Cut version, specifically like the DualShock Director's Cut, then you have like that awful soundtrack. So, as much as I want to recommend that original game, there's too many factors at play for me to definitively say, go play the original without having to, like put in a bunch of asterisks besides that as to what specific version you need to play. So for all intents and purposes, I'll say play the original one if you can, but if not, at least play the remake, as that is easily accessible on literally every platform under the sun, the Switch, the PC, Xbox, PlayStation 3, PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5, Series X, S, 1, 360, and no matter what console you're on, you can play the Resident Evil 1 remake. It's on the GameCube. They even put out a port on the Wii, so literally no matter where you're at, even if you're on a Wii U, you could play it anywhere. There's nothing I can say about Resident Evil 1 that hasn't been said before. It's one of my favorite horror games of all time. In fact, it was basically the first horror game that I played that, really got me into the genre and what made me fall in love with Resident Evil way back in the day. Gosh, I feel so old. But by proxy, I could recommend really the entire Resident Evil series. Even the, some of the more action-packed ones like Resident Evil 6, even those are really good for Halloween time. But no matter what Resident Evil game you play, man, just Resident Evil in general is just such an amazing series. And like I said during the honorable mentions, another one I can recommend that's similar to this would be like Silent Hill. So if you've played every Resident Evil game and you're looking for something similar, I can highly recommend the Silent Hill games. And vice versa. If you played all the Silent Hill games and want something similar, I can highly recommend the Resident Evil games, especially like the early ones. But yeah, all of them are absolutely amazing. And hey, if you've been waiting to pick up Resident Evil 4 Remake, I'm sure it's going to go on sale soon. And if it hasn't, then keep your eyes out, during like Black Friday and such. I'm sure it's going to go on sale. But it's definitely the perfect game for this time of year, man. Resident Evil 4 Remake, easily my game of the year. But anyway, that was 5. Technically 20 or 25 games that I can recommend that you guys play this Halloween. So now I definitely love to hear from you guys. What are some games that you tend to play during this time of year? What are some games that you would recommend to somebody during this time of year? Whatever it is, whatever everything, and I definitely love to hear from you guys. But anyway, as always, a massive shout out, thank you to all the patrons and channel members. Thank you to all of you in the low baller tier, new maker shout out, thank you to all of you in the big baller tier, Miller asking MB Daddy Maddie in the biggest shout out, thank you to all of you in the G tier, Run Avengers, and Cheese Thank you guys so much. You guys are literal legends. I love you. Thank you guys for watching. Have an amazing day. Stay beautiful. I love you all. Peace.